Pseudo-anesthesia. The feminine talent for concealing emotion is probably largely responsible for the common masculine belief that women are devoid of passion, and contemplate its manifestations in the male with something akin to trembling. Here the talent itself is helped out by the fact that very few masculine observers, on the occasions where they give attention to the matter, are in a state of mind conducive to exact observation. The truth is, of course, that there is absolutely no reason to believe that the normal woman is passionless, or that the minority of women who unquestionably are is of formidable dimensions. To be sure, the peculiar vanity of men, particularly in the northern countries, makes them place a high value upon the virginal type of woman, and so this type tends to grow more common by sexual selection, but despite that fact, it has by no means superseded the normal type, so realistically described by the theologians and publicists of the Middle Ages. It would, however, be rash to assert that this long-continued sexual selection has not made itself felt, even in the normal type. Its chief effect, perhaps, is to make it measurably easier for a woman to conquer and conceal emotion than it is for a man. But this is a mere reinforcement of a native quality, or at all events, a quality long antedating the rise of the curious preference just mentioned. That preference obviously owes its origin to the concept of private property, and is most evident in those countries in which the largest proportion of males are property owners. That is, in which the property-owning caste reaches down into the lowest conceivable strata of bounders and ignoramuses. The low-caste man is never quite sure of his wife, unless he is convinced that she is entirely devoid of amorous susceptibility. Thus he grows uneasy whenever she shows any sign of responding in kind to his own elephantine emotions, and is apt to be suspicious of even so trivial a thing as a hearty response to a connubial kiss. If he could manage to rid himself of such suspicions, there would be less public gabble about anesthetic wives, and fewer books written by quacks with sure cures for them, and a good deal less cold mutton formalism and boredom at the domestic hearth. I have a feeling that the husband of this sort, he is very common in the United States and almost uncommon among the middle classes of England, Germany, and Scandinavia, does himself a serious disservice, and that he is uneasily conscious of it. Having got himself a wife to his austere taste, he finds that she is rather depressing, that his vanity is almost as painfully damaged by her emotional inertness as it would have been by too provocative and hedonistic spirit. For one thing, that chiefly delights a man when some woman has gone through the solemn buffoonery of yielding to his great love, is the sharp and flattering contrast between her reserve in the presence of other men and her enchanting complaisance in the presence of himself. Here his vanity is enormously tickled. To the world in general she seems remote and unapproachable. To him she is docile, fluttering, gurgling, even a bit abandoned. It is as if some great magnifico male, some inordinate Tsar or Kaiser should step down from the throne to play dominoes with him behind the door. The greater the contrast between the lady's two fronts, the greater his satisfaction. Up to, of course, the point where his suspicions are aroused. Let her diminish that contrast ever so little on the public side, by smiling at a handsome actor, by saying a word too many to an attentive head-waiter, by holding the hand of the rector of the parish, by winking amiably at his brother or at her sister's husband, and at once the poor fellow begins to look for clandestine notes, to employ private inquiry agents, and to scrutinize the eyes, ears, noses, and hair of his children with shameful doubts. This explains many domestic catastrophes. 15. Mythical anthropophagi. The man-hating woman, like the cold woman, is largely imaginary. One often encounters references to her in literature, but who has ever met her in real life? As for me, I doubt that such a monster has ever actually existed. There are, of course, women who spend a great deal of time denouncing and reviling men, But these are certainly not genuine man-haters. They are simply women who have done their utmost to snare men, and failed. Of such sort are the majority of the inflammatory suffragettes of the sex hygiene and birth control species. The rigid limitation of offspring, in fact, is chiefly advocated by women who run no more risk of having unwilling motherhood forced upon them than so many mummies of the 10th dynasty. All their unhealthy interest in such noisome matters has behind it merely a subconscious yearning to attract the attention of men, who are supposed to be partial to the enterprises that are difficult or forbidden. But certainly the enterprise of dissuading such a propagandist from her gospel would not be difficult, and I know of no law forbidding it. I'll begin to believe in the man-hater the day I am introduced to a woman who has definitely and finally refused a chance of marriage to a man who is of her own station in life, able to support her, unafflicted by any loathsome disease, and of reasonably decent aspect and manners. In brief, a man who is thoroughly eligible. I doubt that any such woman breathes the air of Christendom. Whenever one comes to confidential terms with an unmarried woman, of course, she favors one with a long chronicle of the men she has refused to marry, greatly to their grief. But unsentimental cross-examination, at least in my experience, always develops the fact that every one of these men suffered from some obvious and intolerable disqualification. Either he had a wife already and was vague about his ability to get rid of her, or he was drunk when he was brought to his proposal and repudiated it and forgot it the next day, or he was bankrupt, or he was old and decrepit, or he was young and plainly idiotic, or he had diabetes or a bad heart, or his relatives were impossible, or he believed in spiritualism or democracy or the Baconian theory or some other such nonsense. Restricting the thing to men palpably eligible, I believe thoroughly that no sane woman has ever actually muffed a chance. Now and then, perhaps, a miraculously fortunate girl has two victims on the mat simultaneously and has to lose one. But they are seldom, if ever, both good chances. One is nearly always a duffer, thrown in the telling to make the bourgeoisie marvel. 16. A conspiracy of silence. The reason why all this has to be stated here is simply that women, who could not state it much better, have almost unanimously refrained from discussing such matters at all. One finds, indeed, a sort of general conspiracy infinitely alert and jealous against the publication of esoteric wisdom of the sex, and even against the acknowledgment that any such body of erudition exists at all. Men, having more vanity and less discretion, are a good deal less cautious. There is in fact a whole literature of masculine babbling, ranging from Machiavelli's appalling confession of political theory to the egoistic confidences of such men as Nietzsche, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Casanova, Max Stirner, Benvenuto Cellini, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Lord Chesterfield. But it is very rarely that a Marie Bashkirtsev or Margaret Asquith lets down the veils which conceal the achromatic doctrine of the other sex. It is transmitted from mother to daughter, so to speak, behind the door. One observes its practical workings, but hears little about its principles. The causes of this secrecy are obvious. Women, in the last analysis, can prevail against men in the great struggle for power and security only by keeping them disarmed, and, in the main, unwarned. In a pitched battle, with devil taking the hindmost, their physical and economic inferiority would inevitably bring them to disaster. Thus they have to apply their peculiar talents warily, and with due regard to the danger of arousing the foe. He must be attacked without any formal challenge, and even without any suspicion of challenge. This strategy lies at the heart of what Nietzsche calls the slave morality. In brief, a morality based upon a concealment of egoistic purpose, a code of ethics having for its foremost character a bold denial of its actual aim. Chapter 3, Marriage. 17. Fundamental motives. How successful such concealment may be is well displayed by the general acceptance of the notion that women are reluctant to enter into marriage, that they have to be persuaded to it by eloquence and pertinacity, and even by a sort of intimidation. The truth is that, in a world almost divested of intelligible idealism, and hence dominated by a senseless worship of the practical, marriage offers the best career that the average woman can reasonably aspire to, and, in the case of very many women, the only one that actually offers a livelihood. What is esteemed and valuable in our materialistic and unintelligent society is precisely that petty practical efficiency at which men are expert, and which serves them in place of free intelligence. A woman, save she show a masculine strain that verges upon the pathological, cannot help to challenge men in general in this department, but it is always open to her to exchange her sexual charm for a lion's share in the earnings of one man, and this is what she almost invariably tries to do. That is to say, she tries to get a husband, for getting a husband means, in a sense, enslaving an expert, and so covering up her own lack of expertness and escaping its consequences. Thereafter she has at least one stout line of defense against the struggle for existence, in which the prospect of survival is chiefly based, not upon the talents that are typically hers, but upon those she typically lacks. Before the average woman succumbs in this struggle, some man or other must succumb first. Thus her craft converts her handicap into an advantage. In this security lies the most important of all benefits that a woman attains by marriage. It is, in fact, the most important benefit that the mind can imagine, for the whole effort of the human race under our industrial society is concentrated upon the attainment of it. But there are other benefits too. One of them is that increasing dignity which goes with an obvious success. The woman who has got herself satisfactory husband, or even a highly imperfect husband, is regarded with respect by other women, and has contemptuous patronage for those who have failed to do likewise. Again, marriage offers her the only safe opportunity, considering the Levantine view of women as property which Christianity has preserved in our civilization, to obtain gratification for that powerful complex of instincts which we call the sexual, and, in particular, for the instinct of maternity. The woman who has not had a child remains incomplete, ill at ease, and more than a little ridiculous. She is in the position of a man who has never stood in battle. She has missed the most colossal experience of her sex. Moreover, a social odium goes with her loss. Other women regard her as a sort of permanent tyro, and treat her with ill-concealed disdain, and deride the very virtue which lies at the bottom of her experimental penury. There would seem to be, indeed, but small respect among women for virginity per se. They are against the woman who has got rid of hers outside marriage, not because they think she has lost anything intrinsically valuable, but because she has made a bad bargain, and one that materially diminishes the sentimental respect for virtue held by men, and hence one against the general advantage and well-being of the sex. In other words, it is a guild resentment that they feel, not a moral resentment. Women in general are not actively moral, nor for that matter noticeably modest. Every man, indeed, who is in wide practice among them is occasionally astounded and horrified to discover on some rainy afternoon an almost complete absence of modesty in some women of the highest respectability. But of all things that a woman gains by marriage, the most valuable is economic security. Such security, of course, is seldom absolute, but usually merely relative. The best provider among husbands may die without enough life insurance, or run off with some preposterous light of love, or become an invalid or insane, or step over the intangible and wavering line which separates business success from a prison cell. Again, a woman may be deceived. There are stray women who are credulous and sentimental, and stray men who are cunning. Yet again, a woman may make false deductions from evidence accurately before her, ineptly guessing that the clerk she marries today will be the head of the firm tomorrow, instead of merely the bookkeeper tomorrow. But on the whole, it must be plain that a woman usually obtains for herself a reasonably secure position in that station of life to which she is accustomed. She seeks a husband, not sentimentally, but realistically. She always gives thought to the economic situation. She seldom takes a chance if it is possible to avoid it. It is common for men to marry women who bring nothing to the joint capital of marriage save good looks and appearance of vivacity. It is almost unheard of for women to neglect more prosaic inquiries. Many a rich man, at least in America, marries his typist or the governess of his sister's children and is happy thereafter. But when a rare woman enters upon comparable marriage, she is commonly set down as insane, and the disaster that almost always ensues quickly confirms the diagnosis. The economic and social advantage that women thus seek in marriage, and the seeking is visible no less in the kitchen wench who aspires to the heart of a policeman than in the fashionable flapper who looks for a husband with a Rolls Royce, is by a curious twist of fate one of the underlying causes of the precarious economic condition before marriage rescues them. In the civilization which lays its greatest stress upon an uninspired and almost automatic expertness, and offers its highest reward to the more intricate forms thereof, they suffer the disadvantage of being less capable of it than men. Part of this disadvantage, as we have seen, is congenital. Their very intellectual enterprise makes it difficult for them to become the efficient machines that men are. But part of it is also due to the fact that, with marriage always before them, coloring their every vision of the future, and holding out a steady promise of swift and complete relief, they are under no such implacable pressure as men are to acquire the sordid arts that they revolt against. The time is too short and the incentive too feeble. Before the woman employee of 21 can master a tenth of the idiotic "knowledge" in the head of the male clerk of 30, or even convince herself that it is worth mastering, she has married the head of the establishment, or maybe the clerk himself, and so abandons the business. It is, indeed, not until a woman has definitively put away the hope of marriage, or at all events admitted the possibility that she may have to do soon or late, that she buckles down in earnest to whatever craft she practices, and makes a genuine effort to develop competence. No sane man, seeking a woman for a post requiring laborious training and unremitting diligence, would select a woman still definitely young and marriageable. To the contrary, he would choose either a woman so unattractive sexually as to be palpably incapable of snaring a man, or one so embittered by some catastrophe of amour as to be pathologically emptied of the normal aspirations of her sex. 18. The process of courtship. This bemusement of the typical woman by the notion of marriage has been noted as self-evident by every literate student of the phenomena of sex, from the early Christian fathers down to Nietzsche, Ellis, and Shaw. That it is denied by the current sentimentality of Christendom is surely no evidence against it. What we have in this denial, as I have said, is no more than a proof of women's talent for a high and sardonic form of comedy, and of man's infinite vanity. Quote, "I wooed and won her," says Sagrinel of his wife. Quote, "I made him run," says the hare of the hound. When the thing is maintained not as a mere windy sentimentality, but with some notion of carrying it logically, the result is invariably a display of parology so absurd that it becomes pathetic. Such nonsense one looks for in the works of gynophile theorists with no experience of the world, and there is where one finds it. It is almost always wedded to the astounding doctrine that sexual frigidity, already disposed of, is normal in the female, and that the approach of the male is made possible not by its melting into passion. The female made the male beautiful, italics, that she might endure his caresses. The italics are mine. From this premise, the learned doctor proceeds to the classical sentimental argument that the male of all species, including man, are little more than chronic seducers, and that their chief energies are devoted to assaulting and breaking down the native reluctance of the aesthetic and anesthetic females. In her own words, quote, regarding males, outside of the instinct for self-preservation, which, by the way, is often overshadowed by their great sexual eagerness, no discriminating characters have been acquired and transmitted, italics, but by a purely intellectual determination, inwardly revolting to avoid his ire by pandering to his gross appetites. Thus the thing is stated in a book called, quote, The Sexes in Science and History, end quote, by Eliza Burt Campbell, an American lady anthropologist. Quote, the beautiful coloring of male birds and fishes, and the various appendages acquired by males throughout the various orders below man, and which, so far as they themselves are concerned, serve no other useful purpose than to aid in securing the favors of the females, have by the latter been turned to account in the process of reproduction, other than those which have been the result of passion, end italics, namely, pugnacity and perseverance, end quote. Again, the italics are mine. What we have here is merely the old delusion of masculine enterprise and amour, the concept of man as a lascivious monster and of woman as his shrinking victim, in brief, the Don Juan idea in a fresh bib and tucker. In such bilge lie the springs of many of the most vexatious delusions of the world, and of some of its lauded farce no less. It is thus that fatuous old maids are led to look under their beds for fabulous ravishers, and to cry out that they have been stabbed with hypodermic needles in cinema theaters, and to watch furtively for white slavers in railroad stations. It is thus, indeed, that the whole white slave mountebankery has been launched, with its gaudy fictions and preposterous alarms. And it is thus, more importantly, that whole regiments of neurotic wives have been convinced that their children are monuments, not to cooperation in which their own share was innocent and cordial, but to the solitary libidinous of their swinish and unconscionable husbands. Dr. Gamble, of course, is speaking of the lower fauna in the time of Noah. A literal application of her theory to man today is enough to bring it to a reductio ad absurdum. Which sex of the Homo sapiens actually does the primping and parading that she describes? Which runs to, quote, beautiful coloring, end quote, sartorial hirsute facial? Which encases itself in the vestments which, quote, serve no other useful purpose than to aid in securing the favors, end quote, of the other? The insecurity of the gifted savant's position is at once apparent. The more convincingly she argues that the primeval mud hens and the she mackerel had to be anesthetized with spectacular decorations in order to, quote, endure the caresses, end quote, of their beaux, the more she supports the thesis that men have to be decoyed and bamboozled into love today. In other words, her argument turns upon and destroys itself. Carried to its last implication, it holds that women are all Donna Juanitas, and that if they put off their millinery and cosmetics and abandon the shameless sexual allurements of their scanty dress, men could not, quote, endure their caresses, end quote. To be sure, Dr. Gamble by no means draws this disconcerting conclusion herself. To the contrary, she clings to the conventional theory that the human female of today is no more than the plaything of the concupiscent male, and that she must wait for the feminist millennium to set her free above his abominable pawings. But she can reach this notion only by standing her whole structure of reasoning on its head, in fact by knocking it over and repudiating it. On the one hand, she argues that splendor of attire is merely a bait to overcome the reluctance of the opposite sex, and on the other hand, she argues, at least by fair inference, that it is not. This grotesque switching of horses, however, need not detain us. The facts are too plain to be disposed of by a lady anthropologist's theorizings. Those facts are supported in the field of animal behavior by the almost unanimous evidence of zoologists, including that of Dr. Gamble herself. They are supported in the field of human behavior by a body of observation and experience so colossal that it would be quite out of the question to dispose of it. Women, as I have shown, have a more delicate aesthetic sense than men. In a world wholly rid of men, they would probably still array themselves with vastly more care and thought of beauty than men would ever show in like case. But, with the world what it is, it must be obvious that their display of finery, to say nothing of their display of epidermis, has the conscious purpose of attracting the masculine eye. A normal woman, indeed, never so much as buys a pair of shoes or has her teeth plugged without considering, in the back of her mind, the effect upon some unsuspecting candidate for her, quote, reluctant, end quote, affections. 19. The actual husband. So far as I can make out, no woman of the sort worth hearing, that is, no woman of intelligence, humor, and charm, and hence of success in the duel of sex, has ever publicly denied this. The denial is confined entirely to the absurd sect of female bachelors of arts and to the generality of vain and unobservant men. The former, having failed to attract men by the devices described, take refuge behind the sour grapes doctrine that they have never tried, and the latter, having fallen victims, soothe their egoism by arrogating the whole agency to themselves, thus giving it a specious appearance of the volitional and even of the audacious. The average man is an almost incredible popinjay. He can think of himself only as the center of situations. All the sordid transactions of his life appear to him, and are depicted in his accounts of them as feats, successes, proofs of his acumen. He regards it as an almost magical exploit to operate a stockbroker's shop, or to get elected to public office, or to swindle his fellow knaves in some degrading commercial enterprise, or to profess some nonsense or other in college, or to write so platitudinous a book as this one. And in the same way, he views it as a great testimony to his prowess at amour to yield up his liberty, his property, and his soul to the first woman who, in despair of finding better game, turns her appraising eye upon him. But if you want to hear a mirthless laugh, just present this masculine theory to a bridesmaid at a wedding, particularly after alcohol and crocodile tears have done their disarming work upon her. That is to say, just hint to her that the bride harbored no notion of marriage until stormed into acquiescence by the moonstruck and impetuous bridegroom. I have used the phrase, quote, in despair of finding better game, end quote. What I mean is this, that not one woman in 100 ever marries her first choice among marriageable men. The first choice is almost invariably one who is beyond her talents, for reasons either fortuitous or intrinsic. Let us take, for example, a woman whose relative naivete makes the process clearly apparent, to wit, a simple shop girl. Her absolute first choice, perhaps, is not a living man at all, but a supernatural abstraction in a book, say, one of the heroes of Hal Caine, Ethel M. Dell, or Marie Corelli. After him comes a moving picture actor, then another moving picture actor, then perhaps many more, 10 or 15 head, then a sebaceous young clergyman, then the junior partner in the firm she works for, then a couple of department managers, then a clerk, then a young man with no definite profession or permanent job, one of the innumerable hosts which flits from post to post, always restive, always trying something new, perhaps a neighborhood garage keeper in the end. Well, the girl begins with the Caine Colossus. He vanishes into thin air. She proceeds to the moving picture actors. They are almost as far beyond her. And then to the man of God, the junior partner, the department manager, the clerk. One and all, they are carried off by girls of greater attractions and greater skills, girls who can cast gaudier flies. In the end, suddenly terrorized by the first faint shadows of spinsterhood, she turns to the ultimate numbskull and marries him out of hand. This, allowing for class modifications, is almost the normal history of a marriage, or more accurately, of the genesis of a marriage under Protestant Christianity. Under other rights, the business is taken out of the woman's hands, at least partly, and so she is less enterprising in her assembling of candidates and possibilities. But when the whole thing is left to her own heart, that is, to her head, it is but natural that she should seek a wider range of choice as the conditions of her life allow, and in a democratic society, those conditions put few, if any, fetters upon her fancy. The servant girl, or factory operative, or even prostitute of today may be the chorus girl or moving picture vampire of tomorrow, and the millionaire's wife of next year. In America especially, men have no settled antipathy to such stooping alliances. In fact, it rather flatters their vanity to play Prince Charming to Cinderella. The result is that every normal American young woman, with the practicality of her sex and the inner confidence that goes therewith, raises her amorous eye as high as it will roll. And the second result is that every American man of presentable exterior and easy means is surrounded by an aura of discreet provocation. He cannot even dictate a letter or ask for a telephone number without being measured for his wedding coat. On the continent of Europe, and especially in the Latin countries where class barriers are more formidable, the situation differs materially, and to the disadvantage of the girl. If she makes an overture, it is an invitation to disaster. Her hope of lawful marriage by such means is almost nil. In consequence, the prudent and decent girl avoids such overtures, and they must be made by third parties or by the man himself. This is the explanation for the fact that a Frenchman, say, is habitually enterprising and immoral, and hence bold and often offensive, whereas an American is what is called chivalrous. The American is chivalrous for the simple reason that the initiative is not in his hands. His chivalry is really a sort of coquetry. 20. The unattainable ideal. But here I rather depart from the point, which is this, that the average woman is not strategically capable of bringing down the most tempting game within her purview, and must thus content herself with a second, third, or nth choice. The only women who get their first choices are those who run in almost miraculous luck and those too stupid to formulate an ideal. Two very small classes, it must be obvious. A few women, true enough, are so pertinacious that they prefer defeat to compromise. That is to say, they prefer to put off marriage indefinitely rather than to marry beneath the highest leap of their fancy. But such women may be quickly dismissed as abnormal, and perhaps as downright diseased in mind. The average woman is well aware that marriage is far better for her than celibacy, even when it falls a good deal short of her primary hopes, and she is also well aware that the differences between man and man, once mere money is put aside, are so slight as to be practically almost negligible. Thus the average woman is under none of the common masculine illusions about elective affinities, soul-mates, love at first sight, and such phantasms. She is quite ready to fall in love, as the phrase is, with any man who is plainly eligible, and she usually knows a good many more such men than one. Her primary demand in marriage is not for the agonies of romance, but for comfort and security. She is thus easier satisfied than a man, and oftener happy. One frequently hears of remarried widowers who continue to moon about their dead first wives, but for a remarried widow to show any such sentimentality would be a 9 days' wonder. Once replaced, a dead husband is expunged from the minutes, and so is a dead love. One of the results of all this is a subtle reinforcement of the contempt with which women normally regard their husbands, a contempt grounded, as I have shown, upon a sense of intellectual superiority. To this primary sense of superiority is now added the disparagement of a concrete comparison, and over all is an ineradicable resentment of the fact that such a comparison has been necessary. In other words, the typical husband is a second-rater, and no one is better aware of it than his wife. He is, taking averages, One who has been loved, as the saying goes, but by one woman, and then only as a second, third, or nth choice. If any other woman had ever loved him, as the idiom has it, she would have married him, and so have made him ineligible for his present happiness. But the average bachelor is a man who has been loved, so to speak, by many women, and is the lost first choice of at least some of them. He represents the unattainable and hence the admirable. The husband is the attained and disdained. Here we have sufficient explanation of the general superiority of bachelors, so often noted by students of mankind. A superiority so marked that it is difficult, in all history, to find 6 first-rate philosophers who were married men. The bachelor's very capacity to avoid marriage is no more than a proof of his relative freedom from the ordinary sentimentality of his sex. In other words, of his greater approximation to the clear-headedness of the enemy sex. He is able to defeat the enterprise of women because he brings to the business an equipment almost comparable to their own. Herbert Spencer, until he was 50, was ferociously harassed by women of all sorts. Among others, George Eliot tried very desperately to marry him. But after he had made it plain over a long series of years that he was prepared to resist marriage to the full extent of his military and naval power, the girls dropped off one by one, and so his last decades were full of peace, and he got a great deal of very important work done. 21. The effect on the race. It is, of course, not well for the world that the highest sort of men are thus selected out, as the biologists say, and that their superiority dies with them, whereas the ignoble tricks and sentimentalities of lesser men are infinitely propagated. Despite a popular delusion that the sons of great men are always dolts, the fact is that intellectual superiority is inheritable quite as easily as bodily strength, and that fact has been established beyond cavil by the laborious inquiries of Galton, Pearson, and the other anthropometricians of the English school. If such men as Spinoza, Kant, Schopenhauer, Spencer, and Nietzsche had married and begotten sons, those sons, it is probable, would have contributed as much to philosophy as the sons and grandsons of Weitbach contributed to music, or those of Erasmus Darwin to biology, or those of Henry Adams to politics, or those of Hamilcar Barca to the art of war. I have said that Herbert Spencer's escape from marriage facilitated his life work, and so served the immediate good of English philosophy. But in the long run it will work for a detriment, for he left no sons to carry on his labors, and the remaining Englishmen of his time are unable to supply the lack. His celibacy indeed made English philosophy coextensive with his life. Since his death, the whole body of metaphysical speculation produced in England has been of little more practical value to the world than a drove of hogs. In precisely the same way, the celibacy of Schopenhauer, Kant, and Nietzsche has reduced German philosophy to feebleness. Even setting aside this direct influence of heredity, there is the equally potent influence of example and tuition. It is a gigantic advantage to live on intimate terms with a first-rate man and have his care. Hamilcar not only gave Carthaginians a great general in his actual son, he also gave them a great general in his son-in-law, trained in his camp. But the tendency of first-rate men to remain a bachelor is very strong, and Sidney Lee once showed that of all the great writers of England since the Renaissance, more than half were either celibate or lived apart from their wives. Even the married ones revealed the tendency plainly. For example, consider Shakespeare. He was forced into marriage while still a minor by the brothers of Anne Hathaway, who was several years his senior, and had debauched him and gave out that she was enceinte by him. He escaped from her abhorrent embraces as quickly as possible, and thereafter kept as far away from her as he could. His very distaste for marriage indeed was the cause of his residence in London, and hence, in all probability, of the labours which made him immortal. In different parts of the world, various expedients have been resorted to overcome this reluctance to marriage among the better sort of men. Christianity in general combats it on the ground that it is offensive to God, though at the same time leaning towards an enforced celibacy among its own agents. This discrepancy is fatal to the position. On the one hand, it is impossible to believe that the same God who permitted his own son to die a bachelor regards celibacy as an actual sin. And on the other hand, it is obvious that the average cleric would be damaged but little, and probably improved appreciably, by having a wife to think for him, and to force him to virtue and industry, and to aid him otherwise in his sordid profession. Where religious superstitions have died out, the institution of the dot prevails, an idea borrowed by Christians from the Jews. The dot is simply a bribe designed to overcome the disinclination of the male. It involves a frank recognition of the fact that he loses by marriage, and it seeks to make up for that loss by a money payment. Its obvious effect is to give young women a wider and better choice of husbands. A relatively superior man, otherwise quite out of reach, may be brought into camp by the assurance of economic ease, and what is more, he may be kept in order after he has been taken by the consciousness of his gain. Among hard-headed and highly practical people, such as Jews and the French, the dot flourishes, and its effect is to promote intellectual suppleness in the race, for the average child is thus not inevitably the offspring of a woman and a noodle, as with us, but may be the offspring of a woman and a man of reasonable intelligence. But even in France, the very highest class of men tend to evade marriage. They resist money almost as unanimously as their Anglo-Saxon brethren resist sentimentality. In America, the dot is almost unknown, partly because money-getting is easier to men than in Europe and is regarded as less degrading, and partly because American men are more naive than French men, and are thus readily intrigued without actual bribery. But the best of them nevertheless lean to celibacy, and plans for overcoming their habit are frequently proposed and discussed. One such plan involves a heavy tax on bachelors. The defect in it lies in the fact that the average bachelor, for obvious reasons, is relatively well-to-do, and would pay the tax rather than marry. Moreover, the payment of it would help to salve his own conscience, which is now made restive, I believe, by a maudlin feeling that he is shirking his duty to the race, and so he would be confirmed and supported in his determination to avoid the altar. Still further, he would escape the social odium which now attaches to his celibacy, for whatever a man pays for is regarded as his right. As things stand, that odium is of definite potency, and undoubtedly has its influence upon a certain number of men in the lower ranks of bachelors. They stand, so to speak, in the twilight zone of bachelorhood, with one leg furtively over the altar rail. It needs only an extra pull to bring them to the sacrifice. But if they could compound for their immunity by a cash indemnity, it is highly probable that they would take on a new resolution, and in the end they would convert what remained of their present disrepute into a source of egoistic satisfaction, as is done indeed by a great many bachelors even today. These last immoralists are privy to the elements which enter into that disrepute, the ire of women whose devices they have resisted, and the envy of men who have succumbed. 22. Compulsory marriage. I myself once proposed an alternative scheme, to wit, the prohibition of sentimental marriages by law, and the substitution of matchmaking by the common hangman. This plan, as revolutionary as it may seem, would have several plain advantages. For one thing, it would purge the serious business of marriage of the romantic folderol that now corrupts it, and so make for the peace and happiness of the race. For another thing, it would work against the process which now selects out, as I have said, those men who are most fit, and so throws the chief burden of paternity upon the inferior to the damage of posterity. The hangman, if he made his selections arbitrarily, would try to give his office permanence and dignity by choosing men whose marriage would meet with public approbation, that is, men obviously of sound stock and talents, that is, the sort of men who now habitually escape. And if he made his selection by the hazard of the die, or by drawing numbers out of a hat, or by any other such method of pure chance, that pure chance would fall indiscriminately upon all orders of men, and the upper orders would thus lose their present comparative immunity. True enough, a good many men would endeavor to influence him privately to their own advantage, and it is probable that he would occasionally succumb. But it must be plain that the men most likely to prevail in that enterprise would not be philosophers, but politicians, and so there would be some benefit to the race even here. Posterity surely suffers no very heavy loss when a congressman, a member of the House of Lords, or even an ambassador or prime minister dies childless. But when a Herbert Spencer goes to the grave without leaving sons behind him, there is a detriment to all the generations of the future. I did not offer the plan, of course, as a contribution to practical politics, but merely as a sort of hypothesis to help clarify the problem. Many other theoretical advantages appear in it, but its execution is made impossible, not only by their inherent defects, but also by a general disinclination to abandon the present system, which at least offers certain attractions to concrete men and women, despite its unfavorable effects upon the unborn. Women would oppose the substitution of chance or arbitrary fiat for the existing struggle, for the plain reason that every woman is convinced, and no doubt rightly, that her own judgment is superior to that of either the common hangman or the gods, and that her own enterprise is more favorable to her opportunities. And men would oppose it because it would restrict their liberty. Their liberty, of course, is largely imaginary. In its common manifestation, it is no more at bottom than the privilege of being bamboozled and made a mock of by the first woman who ventures to essay the business. But nonetheless, it is quite as precious to men as any other of the ghosts that their vanity conjures up for their enchantment. They cherish the notion that unconditioned volition enters into the matter, and that under volition there is not only a high degree of sagacity, but also a touch of the daring and the devilish. A man is often almost as much pleased and flattered by his own marriage as he would be by the achievement of what is currently called a seduction. In the one case, as in the other, his emotion is one of triumph. The substitution of pure chance would take away that soothing unction. The present system, to be sure, also involves chance. Every man realizes it, and even the most bombastic bachelor has moments in which he humbly whispers, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." But that chance has a sugar coating. It is swathed in egoistic illusion. It shows less stark and intolerable chanciness, so to speak, than the bald hazard of the die. Thus men prefer it and shrink from the other. In the same way, I have no doubt, the majority of foxes would object to choosing lots to determine the victim of a projected fox hunt. They prefer to take their chances with the dogs. 23. Extra-legal devices. It is, of course, a rhetorical exaggeration to say that all first-class men escape marriage, and even more of an exaggeration to say that their high qualities go wholly untransmitted to posterity. On the one hand, it must be obvious that an appreciable number of them, perhaps by reason of their very detachment and preoccupation, are intrigued into the holy estate, and that not a few of them enter it deliberately, convinced that it is the safest form of liaison possible in their Christianity. And on the other hand, one must not forget the biological fact that it is quite feasible to achieve offspring without the imprimatur of church and state. The thing indeed is so commonplace that I need not risk a scandal by uncovering it in detail. What I allude to, I need not add, is not that form of irregularity which curses innocent children with the stigma of illegitimacy, but that more refined and thoughtful form which safeguards their social dignity, while protecting them against inheritance from their legal fathers. English philosophy, as I have shown, suffers by the fact that Herbert Spencer was too busy to permit himself any such romantic altruism, just as American literature gains enormously by the fact that Walt Whitman adventured, leaving 7 sons behind him, 3 of whom are now well-known American poets and in the forefront of the new poetry movement. The extent of this correction of a salient evil of monogamy is very considerable. Its operations explain the private disrepute of perhaps a majority of first-rate men. Its advantages have been set forth in George Moore's, quote, Euphorion in Texas, end quote, though in a clumsy and sentimental way. What is behind it is the profound race sense of women, the instinct which makes them regard the unborn in their every act. Perhaps, too, the fact that the interests of the unborn are here identical, as in other situations, with their own egoistic aspirations. As the popular philosophy has shrewdly observed, the objections to polygamy do not come from women, for the average woman is sensible enough to prefer half or a quarter or even a tenth of a first-rate man to the whole devotion of a third-rate man. Considerations of much the same sort also justify polyandry, if not morally, then at least biologically. The average woman, as I have shown, must inevitably view her actual husband with a certain disdain. He is anything but her ideal. In consequence, she cannot help feeling that her children are cruelly handicapped by the fact that he is their father, nor can she help feeling guilty about it, for she knows that he is their father only by reason of her own initiative in the proceedings anterior to her marriage. If now an opportunity presents itself to remove that handicap from at least some of them, and at the same time to realize her ideal and satisfy her vanity, if such a chance offers, it is no wonder that she occasionally embraces it. Here we have an explanation of many lamentable and otherwise inexplicable violations of domestic integrity. The woman in the case is commonly dismissed as vicious, but that is no more than a new example of the common human tendency to attach the concept of viciousness to whatever is natural and intelligent, and above the comprehension of politicians, theologians, and greengrocers. 24. Intermezzo on monogamy. The prevalence of monogamy in Christendom is commonly ascribed to ethical motives. This is quite as absurd as ascribing wars to ethical motives, which of course is frequently done. The simple truth is that ethical motives are no more than deductions from experience, and that they are quickly abandoned whenever experience turns against them. In the present case, experience is still overwhelming on the side of monogamy. Civilized men are in favor of it because they find that it works. And why does it work? Because it is the most effective of all available antidotes to the alarms and terrors of passion. Monogamy, in brief, kills passion. And passion is the most dangerous of all the surviving enemies to what we call civilization, which is based upon order, decorum, restraint, formality, industry, regimentation. The civilized man, the ideal civilized man, is simply one who never sacrifices the common security to his private passions. He reaches perfection when he even ceases to love passionately, when he reduces the most profound of all of his instinctive experiences from the level of an ecstasy to the level of a mere device for replenishing the armies and workshops of the world, keeping clothes in repair, reducing the infant death rate, providing enough tenants for every landlord, and making it possible for the palsy eye to know where every citizen is at every hour of the day or night. Monogamy accomplishes this not by producing satiety, but by destroying appetite. It makes passion formal and uninspiring, and so gradually kills it. The advocates of monogamy, deceived by its moral overtones, fail to get all the advantage out of it that is in it. Consider, for example, the important moral business of safeguarding the virtue of the unmarried, that is, of the still passionate. The present plan in dealing, say, with a young man of 20, is to surround him with scarecrows and prohibitions, to try and convince him logically that passion is dangerous. This is both supererogation and imbecility. Supererogation because he already knows that it is dangerous, and imbecility because it is quite impossible to kill a passion by arguing against it. The way to kill it is to give it rein under unfavorable and dispiriting conditions, to bring it down by slow stages to the state of an absurdity and an horror. How much more, then, could be accomplished if the wild young man were forbidden polygamy before marriage, but permitted monogamy? The prohibition in this case would be relatively easy to enforce, instead of impossible as in the other. Curiosity would be satisfied, nature would get out of her cage, even romance would get an inning. 99 young men out of 100 would submit, if only because it would be much easier to submit than to resist. And the result? Obviously, it would be laudable, that is, accepting current definitions of the laudable. The product after 6 months would be a well-regimented and disillusioned young man, as devoid of disquieting and demoralizing passion as an ancient of 80. In brief, the ideal citizen of Christendom. The present plan surely fails to produce the satisfactory crop of such ideal citizens. On the one hand, its impossible prohibitions cause a multitude of lamentable revolts, often ending in a silly sort of running amok. On the other hand, they fill the YMCA's with scared poltroons full of indescribably disgusting forwarding suppressions. Neither group supplies many ideal citizens. Neither promotes the sort of public morality that it is aimed at. 25. Late marriages. The marriage of a first-rate man, when it takes place at all, commonly takes place relatively late. He may succumb in the end, but he is almost always able to postpone the disaster a good deal longer than the average poor clodpate or normal man. If he actually marries early, it is nearly always proof that some intolerable external pressure has been applied to him, as in Shakespeare's case, or that his mental sensitiveness approaches downright insanity, as in Shelley's. This fact, curiously enough, has escaped the observation of an otherwise extremely astute observer, namely Havelock Ellis. In his study of British genius, he notes the fact that most men of unusual capacities are the sons of relatively old fathers. But instead of exhibiting the true cause thereof, he ascribes it to a mysterious quality whereby a man already in decline is capable of begetting better offspring than one in full vigor. This is a palpable absurdity, not only because it goes counter to facts long established by animal breeders, but also because it tacitly assumes that talent, and hence the capacity for transmitting it, is an acquired character, and that this character may be transmitted. Nothing could be more unsound. Talent is not an acquired character, but a congenital character, and the man who is born with it has it in early life quite as well as in later life, though its manifestation may have to wait. James Mill was yet a young man when his son, John Stuart Mill, was born, and not one of his principal books had been written. But though the elements of political economy, and the analysis of the human mind were thus but vaguely formulated in his mind, if they were actually so much as formulated at all, it was 15 years before he wrote them, he was still quite able to transmit the capacity to write them to his son. And that capacity showed itself years afterwards in the latter's Principles of Political Economy and Essay on Liberty. But Ellis's faulty inference is still based upon a sound observation, to wit, that the sort of man capable of transmitting high talents to his son is ordinarily a man who does not have a son at all, at least in wedlock, until he has advanced into middle life. The reasons which impel him to yield even then are somewhat obscure, but 2 or 3 of them perhaps may be vaguely discerned. One lies in the fact that every man, whether of the first class or of any other class, tends to decline in mental agility as he grows older, though in the actual range and profundity of his intelligence he may keep on improving until he collapses into senility. Obviously, it is mere agility of mind, and not profundity, that is of most value and effect in so tricky and deceptive a combat as the duel of sex. The aging man, with his agility gradually withering, is thus confronted by a woman in whom it still luxuriates as a function of their relative youth. Not only do women of his own age aspire to ensnare him, but also women of all ages back to adolescence. Hence his average or typical opponent tends to be progressively younger and younger than he is, and in the end the mere advantage of her youth may be sufficient to tip over in his tottering defenses. This, I take it, is why oldish men are so often intrigued by girls in their teens. It is not that age calls maudlinly to youth, as the poets would have of it. It is that age is no match for youth, especially when age is male and youth is female. The case of the late Heinrich Ibsen was typical. At 40, Ibsen was a sedate family man, and it is doubtful that he ever so much as glanced at a woman. All his thoughts were upon the composition of The League of Youth, his first social drama. At 50, he was almost as preoccupied. A Doll's House was then hatching. But at 60, with his best work all done, his decline begun, he succumbed preposterously to a flirtatious damsel of 18. And thereafter, until actual insanity released him, he mooned like a provincial actor in a sentimental melodrama. Had it not been, indeed, for the fact that he was already married, and to a very sensible wife, he would have run off with this flapper and so made himself publicly ridiculous. Another reason for the relatively late marriages of superior men is found, perhaps, in the fact that as a man grows older, the disabilities he suffers by marriage tend to diminish and the advantages to increase. At 30, a man is terrified by the inhibitions of monogamy and has little taste for the so-called comforts of a home. At 60, he is beyond amorous adventure and is in need of creature ease and security. What he is oftenest conscious of in these later years is his physical decay. He sees himself as in imminent danger of falling into neglect and helplessness. He is thus confronted by a choice between getting a wife or hiring a nurse, and he commonly chooses the wife as the less expensive and exacting. The nurse, indeed, would probably try to marry him anyhow. If he employs her in place of a wife, he commonly ends by finding himself married, and minus a nurse, to his confusion and discomfiture, and to the far greater discomfiture of his heirs and assigns. This process is so obvious and so commonplace that I apologize formally for rehearsing it. What it indicates is simply this, that a man's instinctive aversion to marriage is grounded upon a sense of social and economic self-sufficiency, and that it descends into a mere theory when this self-sufficiency disappears. After all, nature is on the side of mating, and hence on the side of marriage, and vanity is a powerful ally of nature. If men, at the normal mating age, had half as much to gain by marriage as women gain, then all men would be as ardently in favor of it as women are. 26. Disparate unions. This brings us to a fact frequently noted by students of the subject, that first-rate men, when they marry at all, tend to marry noticeably inferior wives. The causes of this phenomena, so often discussed and so seldom illuminated, should be plain by now. The first-rate man, by postponing marriage as long as possible, often approaches it in the end with his faculties crippled by senility, and is thus open to the advances of women whose attractions are wholly meretricious. For example, empty flappers, scheming widows, and trained nurses with a highly developed professional technique of sympathy. If he marries at all, indeed, he must commonly marry badly, for women of genuine merit are no longer interested in him. What was once a lodestar is now no more than a smoking smudge. It is this circumstance that accounts for the low caliber of a good many first-rate men's sons, and gives a certain support to the common notion that they are always third-raters. Those sons inherit from their mothers as well as from their fathers, and the bad strain is often sufficient to obscure and nullify the good strain. Mediocrity, as every Mendelian knows, is a dominant character, and extraordinary ability is a recessive character. In a marriage between an able man and a commonplace woman, the chances that any given child will resemble the mother are, roughly speaking, 3 to 1. The fact suggests the thought that nature is secretly against the Superman, and seeks to prevent his birth. We have, indeed, no ground for assuming that the continued progress visualized by man is in actual accord with the great flow of elemental forces. Devolution is quite as natural as evolution, and may be just as pleasing, or even a good deal more pleasing, to God. If the average man is made in God's image, then a man such as Beethoven or Aristotle is plainly superior to God, and so God may be jealous of him, and eager to see his superiority perish with his bodily frame. All animal breeders know how difficult it is to maintain a fine strain. The universe seems to be in a conspiracy to encourage the endless reproduction of peasants and socialists, but a subtle and mysterious opposition stands eternally against the reproduction of philosophers. Per corollary, it is notorious that women of merit frequently marry second-rate men and bear them children, thus aiding in the war upon progress. One is often astonished to discover that the wife of some sordid and prosaic manufacturer or banker or professional man is a woman of quick intelligence and genuine charm, with intellectual interests so far above his comprehension that he is scarcely so much as aware of them. Again, there are the leading feminists, women artists, and other such captains of the sex. Their husbands are almost always inferior men, and sometimes downright fools. But not paupers, not incompetents in a man's world, not bad husbands. What we here encounter, of course, is no more than a fresh proof of the sagacity of woman. The first-rate woman is a realist. She sees clearly that in a world dominated by second-rate men, the special capacities of the second-rate man are esteemed above all other capacities and given the highest rewards, and she endeavors to get her share of those rewards by marrying a second-rate man at the top of his class. The first-rate man is an admirable creature. His qualities are appreciated by every intelligent woman. As I have just said, it may be reasonably argued that he is actually superior to God. But his attractions after a certain point do not run in proportion to his deserts. Beyond that, he ceases to be a good husband. Hence the pursuit of him is chiefly maintained not by women who are his peers, but by women who are his inferiors. Here we unearth another factor, the fascination of what is strange, the charm of the unlike. Heliogabalisme. As Shakespeare has put it, there must be some mystery in love, and there can be no mystery between intellectual equals. I dare say that many a woman marries an inferior man not primarily because he is a good provider, though it is impossible to imagine her overlooking this, but because his very inferiority interests her and makes her want to remedy it and mother him. Egoism is in the impulse. It is pleasant to have a feeling of superiority and to be assured that it can be maintained. If now that feeling be mingled with sexual curiosity and economic self-interest, it is obviously supplies sufficient motivation to account for so natural and banal a thing as a marriage. Perhaps the greatest of all these factors is the mere disparity, the naked strangeness. A woman could not love a man, as the phrase is, who wore skirts and penciled his eyebrows, and by the same token she would probably find it difficult to love a man who matched perfectly her own sharpness of mind. What she most esteems in marriage, on the psychic plane, is the chance it offers for the exercise of that caressing irony which I have already described. She likes to observe that her man is a fool, dear perhaps, but none the less damned. Her so-called love for him, even at its highest, is always somewhat pitying and patronizing.